Wealth decisions usually involve making decisions about money and how you can actually get more of it. What if you're in a situation with someone who is mentally ill and you have to find ways to keep whatever you already have in order to prevent it from being depleted? We'll be talking about that this week.
This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast about financial blind spots, decision making, and how the reality of higher rates, global tensions, and tariff instability impact your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto.
My guest this week is Sheila Hamilton. She is the founder and CEO of Beyond Well Media. She's a 5-time Emmy Award-winning journalist, and she has written and reported on mental health for more than a decade, including her award-winning memoir, All the Things We Never Knew, Chasing the Chaos of Mental Illness. Her podcast, Beyond Well with Sheila Hamilton, is Spotify's fastest-growing mental health podcast as well. So it's a real pleasure to have you on today. Sheila, how are you today?
I'm great, John. Thanks for having me.
I'd love to begin by having you just set the stage by telling us a little bit about your backstory and how you came to do these things. I'll go into the book and the podcast in a bit, but first of all, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I grew up in Utah in a ranching and farming community, and I was a rodeo cowgirl for many of my early years. But I always loved to write, and I was particularly interested in communicating big ideas to people. And so when I was in college, I got my first internship at PBS. And after that, I was quickly hired at ABC, and I was a journalist for almost 25 years for ABC. And then when my daughter was born, I moved over to radio so that I could spend more time with her and less time on the road.
Wow. Okay. Perhaps because your background is mental illness, and because I don't normally talk about mental illness on this podcast, this is, I think, a good opportunity for you to, let's go from the general to the specific. So maybe if you could begin by telling us why it's important to understand mental illness and perhaps the extent to which it affects people in a macro sense.
I think the reason that I ended up writing a book and starting a podcast and attempting to really understand what the layperson knows about mental illness is because there is such a fine line between when we're doing and mentally unwell. And what I'll say is that all of us are on this spectrum from days where we feel supported and maybe our economic life is in order and our relationships are strong and we've been able to drink adequate amounts of water and have good nutrition. And then there are other weeks where we haven't been sleeping and we're fighting with our partners and our job is on the line, or perhaps we've been laid off, when we really can get into that vulnerable space where all of us are being mentally unwell. And as a layperson, before I had this devastating experience with my late husband, I thought you were either mentally ill or you were normal. That's how little I knew about the range of behaviors and the impact on our mental health. And so I started this podcast and I started the book to educate people like myself who always felt like it was an us and them perspective. You know, they're the ones who have mental illness, and then there's us over here on the mental wellness side. That is explicitly not true. It's the biggest falsehood I think that we're raised with. All of us are susceptible to mental illness, regardless of where we're raised, regardless of our socioeconomic status. And I think it's an important point to begin with.
Yeah, so it's a non-binary sort of consideration. Rather, it's something that exists on a spectrum, and it's just a question of where you are. And presumably, where you are on the spectrum could change with your environment and the way you're dealing with things. And in your research and in your advocacy, do you spend time talking about how it might also be, in some instances, a genetic hereditary factor?
Absolutely, because, you know, in a lot of studies, you see people who have tons of genetic loading, but because they have a steady financial stream, they have great community around them, they have managed to lead a somewhat balanced and stress-free life, they don't end up developing a mental illness. And then you see people who have very few genetic links who go through trauma, go through some sort of abuse or neglect, don't get adequate help, don't have specific socioeconomic support, and they end up developing a mental illness. So there is a really important binary to pay attention to, and that is, what is your family history? And then what are you doing in your current life to make sure that you're holding up the foundation that supports all of our mental health?
Okay, so your podcast has guests who help us to understand, this is your terminology, behaviors in relationship to the way we're thinking. And my podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions. So I try to get people to think about how they think about finances. So the phrase that neither of us have mentioned explicitly is meta thinking about thinking. And I encourage people to think about decision making. And I think you're encouraging people to open up and be a little more aware of what goes into mental health. To what extent would you say people are reflective about how they think? And to what extent do you believe people make conscious decisions about their decision making so they can say, okay, am I really looking at this the right way? Do they go back and examine their first principles with regard to beliefs, values, anything?
It's a great question. And I'll just use myself as an example. In my late 30s and 40s, I was on such a fast track of my career and trying to raise a family and trying to squeeze in time for a workout. I never considered the messaging that I was allowing my brain to spout off on. I never considered quieting my brain. I never considered how it was that I should be probably looking at the patterns of thoughts in terms of how perfectionistic and negative my thinking was. And it took a crisis for me to understand that our brains are very active, but they're often not our best friends. And so I would say that in mental health, probably the biggest factor about people going down a track to eventual suicidality is that they start believing what their brain is telling them. They start believing their thoughts. And instead of being able to observe and to release and decision make about which thoughts they're going to allow to really impact their lives and which thoughts they're going to excuse, they go down a route where their thinking becomes very, very aberrant and kind of cyclical. And I watched it happen in real time with my husband. He was one of the most positive, enigmatic people that I've ever met. And by the end of his bout with mental illness, he was on a racetrack of depressing, self-loathing, horrid suicidal thoughts.
To what extent do you think the average person can stop, assess, step back, and detach themselves from what's going on in their head? For instance, I'm wondering about things like, say, meditation. Do people understand really how meditation might be useful in calming the mind and gaining a sense of perspective that might otherwise be lost if you're too caught up in the day-to-day?
I think meditation is so phenomenal, and I wish more people had access to it. I'm going to use myself as an example again. I grew up in a somewhat dysfunctional, quite violent childhood, and my nervous system has always been too wired to try to settle myself enough for meditation. What I have found that's really easy for me to be able to do is to walk in nature, to be able to actually stretch in yoga and take note of what type of thoughts I'm currently chewing on. And I think that we get too binary with people around how to approach stilling the mind. And I wish more people would talk about the many ways that you can be mindful, because we are all mindful.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about your book. Your book, All the Things We Never Knew, resonates with me personally because I have a former spouse who I also strongly suspect suffers from mental illness. And the word that I learned after separating from her is anosognosia. I don't know if you actually like the technical terminology.
I do. Yeah.
It's one of those fancy words. It's basically people who are sick, but they refuse to acknowledge that they're sick. And you don't solve problems that you don't acknowledge. And if you can't get people to see their own illness, then fat chance in getting them to fix the problem. So What advice would you give to people who have someone in their family, a loved one, perhaps a spouse, perhaps a sibling, who they suspect is unwell, but it's difficult to bring it up because they will simply deny it and they'll think that you're the one who's unwell for having the temerity to even bring it up?
I spoke with a person who's done probably half of his life's research on anosognosia, and he was telling me that probably as many as 60% of serious mental illness people have this. And it is because it's a distortion of the brain, right? It's not just that they refuse to get help. It's that they actually do not recognize their behavior as being problematic, their critical thinking skills as being limited. They're not capable. And that distinction, John, really helped me because when my husband was getting very, very sick and I was attempting to try to get him to go into treatment, I wanted him desperately to see how his behavior was impacting us. Now knowing that he couldn't actually cognitively comprehend what I was trying to say has made me way less angry at him and way more understanding that it is an illness. And so I guess I would begin with the suggestion is to start with compassion. If this was a person who had a late stage cancer and they were refusing treatment, you'd want to gently understand the reasons why. You'd want to try to talk with them about their own feelings about treatment. You'd want to really understand where they were coming from. And with a person with anosognosia, you have to do the added work of saying, here's how your behavior is impacting us. This is what's happening because of this behavior. This is what happens when you are spending unwisely, when you are cheating on your partner, when you are refusing to show up for things that we've agreed to, when you are not doing your part of the child care. This is the really important thing for me, is that you begin from a point of compassion, a point of understanding, but that you're also really firm on how that behavior is impacting everyone around them.
I have to ask you a question that, because this relates to me personally, so I'm being selfish here, but
That's okay.
What would one do if the people, the other members of the family that are also presumably seeing the illness and being affected by it are themselves enabling the illness and not acknowledging what is plain as day to anybody who wants to be fair-minded about what they see and experience?
It's very common because, mental illness has such a stigma attached to it that nobody wants to admit that they have a child or a partner or a person they love who is suffering. Nobody wants that to be their reality. What I have always said to friends, because this was very much the case that I had to go through as well, was how do you problem solve anything that has to take into account other people's biases, their histories, their feelings, their beliefs? You do it very carefully. You take a lot of time settling your own nervous system before you begin that conversation. And then you say, because this is impacting me more than it's impacting you, I have decided that I am going to enlist a therapist to help us figure out what's going on. There's a certain point at which you have to draw a boundary for yourself around how a person's behavior impacts you. And when a person has mental illness, it's very, very difficult because there's a lot of denial going on. And I'm guilty because I would say that I was in denial more than most for a long, long time.
What would you say is the state of preparedness for, let's say, the therapist that you might engage? Because certainly with my experience, again, forgive me for being autobiographical, but I engaged therapists in the hope that they would hold the counterparty in the marriage accountable. And no, they just played along as though everything was fine, and they did nothing to properly identify the source of the concern. And so here I am sliding line and verse as to what's wrong and what's different and what's not being resolved and what's not changing. They would use their song. I would think that they would actually they would use a toolkit that is predicated on the person not being unwell. And if they themselves cannot properly diagnose the pathology of the person being unwell initially, then everything that follows is going to be useless because you're not getting to the root of the problem.
If you talk to people who have lost someone to suicide, you hear a common theme again and again, and that is, I tried to get help. I took them to many therapists. I tried to get them into inpatient care. In America, are laws that protect people with mental illness heavily outweigh those of the people around them that are getting hurt. And so in America, at least in the states where I've lived, the person has to show they are a risk to themselves or to others in that moment. And that's very difficult to catch someone at that pinnacle moment where they're just ready to take and accept care because somehow they've recognized in themselves that they may not be doing well. It is incredibly different. And it's why I have argued for a balancing of laws around helping people with mental illness. And what I always advise family is it's really smart if you have a kid or a partner with a mental illness when they are doing well to form an agreement around what behaviors you both agree would be problematic enough to be able to seek professional care. And that's generally inpatient care.
Right. So in behavioral finance, they call that a pre-commitment.
Yeah.
If you can get someone to agree in advance as to what they will do down the road if a certain set of circumstances were to present themselves so that you understand you've got let's call it a moral obligation, a pact with yourself and with others that you care about as to what you will do, because it may not always be exactly the same, but history has a way of rhyming.
Yes, it does.
And it's one of those things where I think that kind of dare I use the word intervention, might be of some value because there's an agreement. All right. So I think it would be good to maybe I'll tell you a little bit about what I went through, and then maybe you can share a little bit about what you went through to see if we can sort of talk about decision making. So the podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions. And, on the surface, it's like, well, why are we having a conversation about mental health? But mental health is a decision in terms of how to cope and how to respond and how to adapt. And then it oftentimes has financial consequences. And as a result, I thought, no, actually, this is a good fit. So with me, I had a spouse that was starting a lawsuit that was spurious, and it ended up in the reckless depletion of household assets because of the legal fees being incurred, and not to mention the reputation of the person that was accused, who really had done nothing wrong and was just doing his job normally. So that was a challenge for me, and that was what I had a real challenge in getting other family members to acknowledge because they didn't, because of the stigma that you mentioned earlier. Could you please tell us a little bit about what you went through and why and how you coped and what happened at the end?
First of all, sorry you had to go through that, John. I have just enormous empathy for anyone that's caught in a domestic situation where someone is seriously mentally ill and acting out in a way that's harmful to those around them. It is incredibly complex. It is not black and white ever. If you spoke to your ex-wife today, she would tell me a completely different story, but I am sorry for the impact that it had on you. My husband was a very gifted builder designer. He was from Canada, by the way, and we fell in love and had really thriving marriage for a few years, and then I started to learn that he was cheating on me. I kind of put some boundaries around that I now, in hindsight, felt like very flimsy to me. But as he went on, he began to have just stranger and stranger behavior where he would be filled with energy, just, chopping down trees and trying to give us a year's worth of firewood in a modern house. And then the next day, tethered to his bed, he couldn't even move. And I didn't know what bipolar disorder was. I'd never seen the highs and the lows of a mental illness before, so I didn't know what I was dealing with. And when I finally asked him to start getting some sort of care or intervention, he refused, did the same thing that it sounds like happened in your household where they say, you're the problem and you're the person who needs help. And so I essentially took my daughter as far away from his volatile behavior as I could. We began being separated in kind of week on, week off things where it was clear to me that we were headed to divorce. And when he realized we were getting divorced, he got very panic stricken and finally saw a friend who gave him some pills to help him sleep, and it was antidepressants. And for a person with bipolar disorder, if you're listening, antidepressants are among the most harmful psychotropic medication you can take because it puts them into a state of akathisia, which is, he described it as Dante's 10th circle of hell. He was up all night long. He was screaming. He was on his knees. He was so impossible to reach at that point. And he was finally mandated to inpatient psychiatric care. And the day after he got out, he died by suicide. And I spoke to a person who treated him, and they said that my husband had become what therapists call unreachable. And I believe it was because there were so many years that the illness was getting worse that I didn't force him either by leaving much earlier or force him into communication that really mandated that he pay attention to his mental health, that his condition worsened. And I carry a great deal of guilt and sorrow because of that. I just did not know what I did not know.
No. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry to hear about your story. It's heartbreaking. You know, when good people have to suffer immense trauma, they would do more if they knew what could be done and what needed to be done. But there's just this huge gap in identifying the problem. And as I said before, problems that don't get identified don't get solved, right? And so could you maybe, since we're again talking about money here, what if someone in your life suffers from a gambling addiction? Would you have any kind of counsel that you would give in that respect?
I don't know so much about gambling addiction, but what I do know, John, is that the financial devastation that my late husband left was enough to leave me with a few sage pieces of advice for other women. And that is, we had always run our lives quite independently. I would pay the mortgage. He would pay for tuition for our daughter, blah, blah, blah. At a certain point, what I realized is that I had stopped checking in with him on how his business was doing. And when he left, because for almost a year, he'd stopped asking anyone he was doing work for to pay him. That's how unwell he was. He had left a $100,000 debt. He had so many outstanding warrants and bills that he had been hiding in a huge duffel bag. If I had not been such a scrupulous saver, a really savvy investor, it would have wiped me out. And what I really want women to know is, even if you think you're protected because you have another LLC, another business set up that allows you to run your own business, if your partner isn't doing well and he's not paying his debts and he's not showing up in court when he's demanded to, you are on the hook for that debt. It was the roughest lesson that I think I had to learn, because I have been investing since I was like 19 years old. And yet I didn't realize that I would be responsible for my husband's company debt.
Yeah, that's another wealth decision that you have to learn about making, that you probably never ever thought you would ever have to deal with. I have a similar story that I can tell you with a colleague from a former firm who had a couple, and the guy, they had a joint account, and it was, I don't know, substantial enough, maybe a little over $250,000. There were joint assets, and the husband would call on a sporadic basis every couple months and say, you know, I need $20,000 here, I need $25,000 there. Over the span of a couple of years, the joint account was totally depleted. Yeah. And then the family came in for a meeting, and the advisor was talking to the couple about the assets, and the wife had never checked the joint account. She had her own account. Obviously, you can't, get into her registered assets because they're in her name and so forth. But unregistered assets that are held jointly, back in the day in the 1990s, because this is how far back it went, if one spouse would say, I need money from a joint account, people didn't always take the care to contact the other spouse and say, hey, are you okay with this? Yeah. So basically the bottom line is the guy had gambling addiction, depleted the entire $250,000 or whatever it was account. And the wife didn't find out about it until they were in the advisor's office for a meeting. And of course, the advisor then realized that, I've been a bit presumptive in terms of letting this money go without checking with the former spouse. And so there was a bit of a liability on the spouse's part for not being careful, but there was a lot of liability on the part of the financial advisor for having given up joint assets without checking both parties to make sure that it was in fact acceptable to both parties. Okay, we're nearing the end, and it's a bit of an unhappy topic, but you're a real fountain of information and experience, and a best-selling author and a best-selling podcaster. So I want to leave the floor to you at the end here to ask you what advice you would give to people that are listening in today in terms of making better wealth decisions when dealing with a loved one who is, whether technically and clinically diagnosed or not, whether or not when you're dealing with someone who has a mental illness?
I would just say that I think as women in particular, or as peacemakers in particular, people who want to try to get along, you have to develop a different identity when you're dealing with someone who has any kind of mental impairment. Because what happened to me, and I think happens to a lot of women, is you think it can change. You think that the person might get better. You think that by being more loving, more conscientious, more helpful, more pliable, that the situation is going to get better. And I'm here to say it doesn't. It almost requires an added level of scrutiny, of communication, of due diligence that I don't think a lot of marriages have, and does require it because spending is such a hallmark, irrational spending is such a hallmark, in particular, of bipolar disorder. And so what I would say is, demand that extra communication, set up agreements. If the person is not actually abiding by the agreements, it's time to actually separate, make sure that your finances are separated from that person, and support them from afar. And I know that that sounds like such a difficult line, but from what I've heard from every therapeutic practitioner that I've spoken to, the longer you stay in and help that person's erratic behavior continue, the worse harm you're doing. And so I leave you just with those two thoughts, which is, if you can't get the person to communicate honestly, to agree to boundaries, to agree to a new set of behaviors, it is time to leave the marriage or the relationship, if only to try to save the marriage or the relationship.
Okay. Talking about making better wealth decisions. This week, we're talking about wealth decisions that hopefully not many people listening will ever have to make. But it's important that you have the tools if the situation presents itself in you and your life. So I want to thank you today, Sheila. I know that your life has been hard, but you do wonderful and important work, and it is very sincerely appreciated. I want to thank you for your time today.
Absolutely, John. I've really enjoyed our time together. Thank you.
This podcast is not to be construed as offering specific investment advice. Please consult a qualified advisor before acting. My books, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry and Bullshift, are available online. If you'd like to meet to discuss how the topics in this podcast affect you directly, please visit my website.